In the dead of winter, 1942, a U.S. cargo plane disappeared into Greenland's frozen silence. On November 5, 1942, the Douglas C-53 Skytrooper went down on the vast ice cap, stranding 5 airmen in brutal Arctic conditions. For 148 days, the survivors would fight a nightmare of whiteouts, subzero cold, and hidden crevasses, a struggle that would require multiple rescue missions. Decades later, this ordeal would be chronicled in Frozen in Time and inspire a modern expedition to recover the remains of lost airmen. This is their story. November 1942. World War II rages across continents, and the Arctic is an unforgiving front. A routine cargo flight over Greenland has vanished into the ice. A search and rescue mission is launched, but disaster strikes again. A B-17 Flying Fortress, sent to find the missing plane, flies into a blinding whiteout and crashes onto the Greenland ice cap. Suddenly, 2 aircraft are down in the middle of nowhere, their crews at the mercy of the polar winter. The stakes could not be higher. Starvation, sub-zero temperatures, howling winds, and isolation prey on the survivors. Meanwhile, one rescue attempt after another falters or ends in tragedy, as if gremlins were sabotaging every lifeline. How long can these men hang on? Who, if anyone, will reach them in time? And what price will rescuers pay to bring them home from this frozen hell? These questions drive our story as we journey through a 40-minute saga of courage, endurance, and the indomitable will to survive against impossible odds. November 9th, 1942. Above the stark Greenland coast, a B-17F Flying Fortress designated PN-9E drones through turbulent skies. The bomber and its 9 crewmen have been diverted from their transatlantic ferry route to search for a missing C-53 transport plane. Below them stretches a limitless expanse of white, the Greenland ice cap, where the cargo plane disappeared days ago. The pilots squint out the cockpit. Everything is the same frightening shade of whitish gray. Sky and ground fuse into a disorienting haze. Inside the B-17, Lieutenant Armand Monteverde, the pilot, tightens his grip on the controls as the aircraft suddenly shudders. They've flown into a milk-white void, a cloud bank blending seamlessly with the snow-covered ice. With no horizon, Monteverde might as well be blind. He banks away instinctively, hoping to return to clearer air. But in an instant, the fortress's left wingtip snags something solid, the ground. A jarring crunch echoes through the fuselage as the massive plane slams onto the glacier. Metal screams and shatters. The B-17 skids roughly 200 yards over the ice before grinding to a halt. Silence, then groans of pain. Miraculously, all 9 men are alive, but the aircraft is torn open. The entire tail section has broken off and now dangles precariously over a gaping crevasse at the crash site. Another yawning chasm gapes just in front of the bomber's nose. They have crash-landed atop an active glacier riddled with hidden ice tunnels, as if marooned in the middle of a minefield. In the initial tally, 1 crewman's arm is broken, others suffer cuts and bruises, while a few emerge miraculously unhurt. Shocked and shivering, the men scramble out of the wreckage before something collapses. Lieutenant Monteverde and Lieutenant Harry Spencer, the co-pilot, quickly take stock. Lieutenant Bill O'Hara, the navigator, winces in pain. His feet are already numb from cold, boots soaked during the crash. The Arctic is asserting its claim. They all know that survival now depends on immediate action. The daylight is fading fast. In the high latitudes of Greenland, November days are brief. The wind howls across the ice, laced with stinging particles of snow. Monteverde realizes they can't stay exposed for long. The men salvage what they can from the wreck: sleeping bags, a few rations, a hand-crank radio transmitter, any tools or clothing. Using shards of aluminum and parachute cloth, they improvise shelter. For now, the shattered B-17 itself is their only refuge. They retreat into the less damaged forward fuselage section, cramming together for body heat. Through the night, Arctic winds shake the wreckage and temperatures plummet far below freezing. The crew's breath hangs in clouds as they huddle under whatever insulation they have, starting a vigil that will last far longer than any of them can imagine. Just a few days prior, On November 5, 1942, a U.S. Army Air Force C-53 Skytrooper cargo plane had also met misfortune in Greenland. With 5 men aboard returning from a supply run to Europe, the C-53 radioed that it was making a forced landing on the ice cap amid engine trouble or severe weather. Its crew gave an approximate position on the desolate southeastern ice cap before all fell silent. For 2 nights, far off at a lonely coastal weather station, observers spotted distant flares, distress signals fired by the downed C-53 crew. Rescue teams attempted to reach them, venturing onto the ice with motorized sledges, but fierce conditions turned them back. A snowstorm and mechanical breakdowns thwarted their sleds, and the flares went dark. The C-53 and its 5 men seemed to vanish into the blizzard. By November 9th, when Monteverde's B-17 took off to help search, the fate of the C-53 was a chilling question mark. And now the would-be rescuers have become survivors of a crash themselves. Dawn after the B-17 crash brings only a bleak gray twilight. The crew of 9 awakens to the stark reality of their situation. They are alone on an ice cap larger than Texas. The radio operator, Corporal Lauren Lolly Howarth, sets up the emergency transmitter in the shattered fuselage and begins sending distress calls. At first, only static answers. The men's voices are hoarse and their faces drawn with cold, but they force down some of their scant provisions, canned rations from the B-17's survival kit, and plan next steps. In the distance, nothing but endless white. They name their crash site Snowball Camp, a dark joke on the Air Transport Command's nickname for the ferry route through Greenland, the Snowball Route. Over the next day, Howarth finally makes radio contact with a U.S. Army weather station located on the coast, known as Beachhead Station. Relief washes over the crew. At least others know they're alive. By November 10th, word of the B-17's plight reaches command posts. Plans are immediately set in motion to rescue the men, even as searchers still hope for signs of the missing C-53. But the weather has other ideas. A brutal storm system locks down the region with near-constant blizzards, grounding any immediate rescue flights. For days on end, the survivors at Snowball Camp endure blinding winds and searing cold, while rescue aircraft at the nearest base sit idle. Inside the wreck, time crawls. The Arctic winter is closing in. Each day the sun hangs lower, and soon polar night will enshroud them in darkness 24/7. The crew maintains a strict routine to keep despair at bay. They take turns stomping through the snow to check for any sign of a rescue party and to stretch their legs so they don't freeze in place. They clear snow off the fuselage to make their temporary home visible to search planes. Each evening they retreat under the B-17's wing or into its broken hull for shelter, wrapping themselves in parachute cloth and whatever insulation they can improvise. Despite their efforts, the cold is merciless. Fingers and toes go numb and waxy white with frostbite. Lieutenant O'Hara's feet, having gotten wet during the crash, are now freezing solid, a life-threatening situation if not resolved quickly. The men remove O'Hara's boots and are horrified to see his toes turn black. They do what they can, binding his feet, sharing their body heat, but deep down they know gangrene is a looming threat. After almost 2 weeks stranded, the weather finally breaks. On November 24th, 1942, the clouds lift enough for a reconnaissance flight. Cutting through the frigid air, a silver C-54 Skymaster, a military DC-4, appears, piloted by the famed Arctic aviator Colonel Bernd Balchen. Balchen is an experienced polar explorer leading the U.S. search and rescue operations in Greenland. Risking the fickle weather, he flies out of Bluey West 8, Sondre Stromfjord, and tirelessly scans the whiteness below. Finally, he spots a dark shape on the ice, the wreck of PN-9E. Circling low, Balchen's crew can see movement, survivors. A jolt of joy courses through the stranded men as the big 4-engine plane soars overhead. They scramble out and wave furiously. Balchen radios the position to base. The B-17 is approximately 40 miles inland from the coast, sitting on a crevasse-riddled glacier in southeast Greenland. Immediately, plans kick into high gear. With weather temporarily clear, airdropping supplies is the first priority. That very day, Balchen's C-54 returns to make a daring supply drop. The B-17 crew watches as the Skymaster swoops low and parachutes tumble out, blossoming against the gray sky. Crates thud onto the ice, food, fuel, winter clothing, medicine, a lifeline from above. The men cheer and rush to gather the canisters before the glacier's many crevasses can swallow them. At last, they have mittens and parkas, more canned rations, even treats like chocolate and instant coffee to lift their spirits. Night arrives, and with it, the first stars of the polar winter. But now, a flicker of hope has been kindled. Over their crackling radio, the survivors hear that a rescue team is coming. As they divvy up a hot meal of ration stew heated on a small stove fueled by aircraft fuel, they allow themselves a rare luxury: optimism. Each man silently imagines being home by Christmas. Outside, the Arctic night is vast and dark, but for the first time, they do not feel completely alone. Even as the B-17 crew's spirits lift, elsewhere in Greenland more trouble brews. The region has seemingly become a Bermuda Triangle of the Arctic. In addition to the missing C-53 and the downed B-17, yet another aircraft falls victim to the elements. An RAF twin-engine, Douglas Havoc, being ferried by a Canadian crew, gets lost in a snowstorm and is forced to land on the ice cap with empty fuel tanks. Though the Havoc's crew survives the landing, they are now stranded too. Thankfully, their ordeal is brief. They set out on foot and within days are found and rescued by a Coast Guard team from the cutter Northland that followed their trail of makeshift snowshoe tracks. By late November, Greenland's frozen wilderness has ensnared at least 3 aircraft. Bad things come in threes, people say, but in Greenland, bad luck seems boundless. The string of crashes and disappearances has airmen whispering about gremlins. In World War II lore, gremlins are the mischievous spirits blamed when aircraft malfunction for no reason. Surely, some joke grimly, gremlins must be lurking on this ice cap, dooming each rescue attempt as if the land itself is cursed. The B-17 crew, fighting off fear in their frozen shelter, hear occasional radio news of these events. They learn the Havoc men are safe, a relief tempered by the knowledge that their own rescue is proving far more difficult. If anything, the dangers surrounding them have multiplied. Now commanding the broader rescue operation, Colonel Balkin strategizes a multi-pronged effort. He has limited daylight and increasingly savage weather to contend with. Balchin knows that trying to land a large airplane near the crash site is extremely risky, but smaller aircraft might manage it. He requests the assistance of the U.S. Coast Guard, which has a ship patrolling Greenland's coastal waters equipped with a small rescue plane, a Grumman J 2 F-4 Duck amphibious biplane. Aboard the cutter USCGC Northland, Lieutenant John Pritchard and radioman Benjamin Bottoms stand ready with their diminutive Duck. These two men have already proven themselves heroes. Just days earlier, on November 23rd, Pritchard led a daring night climb on foot to rescue 3 downed Canadian flyers on the ice cap, for which he earned a Navy and Marine Corps medal. Now, Pritchard and Bottoms prepare to risk everything again to save the Americans of PN-9E. Morning of November 28, 1942. The Arctic dawn is a mere dim glow as the crew of the Northland hoists the Duck over the side and onto icy water. Braving freezing spray and gusting winds, Lieutenant Pritchard and Petty Officer 1 Bottoms throttle up the Duck's engine and take off, disappearing inland toward the crash site. In the B-17 camp, it's another frigid day of waiting. The men stomp their feet and swing their arms to fend off frostbite. Around mid-morning, the drone of an aircraft engine echoes over the ice. The Duck is approaching. Spotting the B-17's blackened wreck, Pritchard carefully overflies it to scout a landing spot. Radioing down, Pritchard asks Monteverde for any advice on where to land. Corporal Howarth, manning the handheld radio on the ground, warns him of the countless crevasses. "Don't try it. Crevasses everywhere." But Pritchard has already spotted a seemingly smooth, gently sloped area about a mile north of the wreck. With consummate skill, he brings the Duck in low. Instead of using the landing gear, which could snag in the snow, he decides to use the plane's central flotation pontoon as an improvised ski. The bright yellow Duck touches down on the open snow, skids uphill, and miraculously comes to a safe stop. It is the first successful landing on Greenland's ice-capped surface by any airplane. Pritchard and Bottoms have achieved the impossible. The B-17 survivors whoop with joy and scramble to meet their saviors. Monteverde and Spencer help two of the weaker crewmen, the walking wounded, prepare to evacuate first. They choose the crew members who can still hobble through the snow but are suffering from injuries, likely the man with the broken arm and another with severe frostbite. Everyone knows the small duck can only take a couple of passengers at a time. Pritchard and Bottoms arrive at the B-17 after a laborious 2-mile hike, carefully probing the ice with a broomstick to avoid hidden crevasses. When the survivors see the Coast Guardsmen trudging toward them, rugged and determined, some break into relieved laughter. Others fight back tears. Rescue is finally at hand. At the crash site, Pritchard quickly but calmly introduces himself. He informs Monteverde that he can shuttle the crew out 2 at a time, making multiple trips as needed. Without wasting time, they all trek back across the ice toward the duck, escorting the first 2 evacuees. The process is arduous. The snow conceals deep cracks in the glacier, and every step must be tested. But by afternoon, Pritchard, Bottoms, and the 2 chosen airmen reach the duck safely and cram into its tiny cabin. Pritchard decides on an unorthodox takeoff. He and Bottoms had earlier shoveled snow away from the duck's landing gear and manually retracted the wheels so the plane can slide on its belly. Now, with everyone aboard, he points the nose downhill on the slope he landed. The duck's engine roars to life, the little plane skimming over the snow and lifting off just before the terrain drops away. Against the odds, Pritchard's first extraction is a success. Back on the Northland cutter that evening, the crew watches anxiously as dusk falls. Suddenly, the duck appears out of the gloom, navigating by the ship's powerful searchlights. The first 2 B-17 crewmen are brought aboard to warmth and safety. They are exhausted, frostbitten, but alive. As the ship's doctor tends to them, one man murmurs through chattering teeth about the comrades still on the ice. He knows Pritchard will go back for the others. He has to. There are 7 men still stranded at Snowball Camp, including the badly injured navigator O'Hara. That night, on the ice cap, Monteverde's group is jubilant that 2 of their brothers have been saved. Spirits soar higher when the survivors learn via radio that the duck will return the next morning to get more of them out. They spend the night making careful plans. Who should go next, how to assist O'Hara, whose legs are now in grave condition, and how to break camp once rescue is complete. In the darkness, one of them scribbles in a diary that November 29th just might be the day they all cheat death. November 29th, 1942. At first light, Pritchard and Bottoms are already airborne, determined to evacuate as many of the remaining men as possible before an approaching storm arrives. On the ice, the B-17 crew pack their meager belongings and prepare O'Hara for transport, fashioning a rough sled to pull him since he can't walk. Unknown to them, help is also converging overland. An Army rescue party with 2 motorized sledges has been inching its way toward the crash site for days. This morning, by sheer coincidence, the Army sled team reaches the vicinity almost exactly when the duck comes in to land again. As Pritchard brings the duck down, this time intentionally belly landing it on the snow without extending the landing gear, the men at Snowball Camp spot movement on the horizon. One of the Army's Weasel motor sleds emerges, chugging toward them. But before the survivors can even cheer, disaster strikes. The Second Army sled behind the first suddenly plunges through the snow. It hits a hidden crevasse. An ice bridge collapses under its weight. In an instant, the vehicle and its driver are swallowed by a bottomless fissure, vanishing without a trace. The sole remaining Army rescuer stops, horrified and helpless. One of his comrades is just gone. He radios an emergency report of the accident. The men at the B-17 freeze in shock at this grim reminder of the glacier's deadly unpredictability. Fog is now rolling in fast, the weather turning on a dime. Lieutenant Monteverde realizes the situation is deteriorating and urges haste. He sends Corporal Howarth, the radio man, to run to the duck's landing site and warn Pritchard, "Get out while you can." The fog threatens to strand everyone if they delay. Howarth dashes off and meets Pritchard and Bottoms coming from their plane. He delivers Monteverde's urgent plea to evacuate immediately. With visibility dropping by the minute, Pritchard faces an agonizing decision whom to take on this flight. He had hoped to ferry 2 men at a time again, but with the encroaching storm, it's clear this may be the last chance for a while. Lieutenant O'Hara is in critical shape, but moving him in these conditions could be fatal if the duck can't take off. Monteverde and the others watch from a distance, praying for a safe escape. Time is up. Pritchard decides to depart with 1 passenger this trip to maximize the duck's odds of getting airborne in the thickening fog. Corporal Lolly Howarth, having carried the message, is right there with them, and possibly Pritchard feels the young radioman will be an asset on board given the treacherous weather. Alternatively, perhaps Howarth, exhausted and frostbitten, begs to go. In any case, Pritchard, Bottoms, and Howarth climb into the duck for the return to the cutter. On the ground, Monteverde's heart sinks to see only one of his men leaving, but he steels himself, knowing the rest must hold out longer. He waves bravely as the duck's engine revs. In swirling snow, the little biplane lifts off the ice and disappears into low cloud almost immediately. The remaining 6 survivors, Monteverde, Spencer, O'Hara, and Private Spina, Tucciaroni, and Puryear, or Best, retreat to their camp with the lone Army rescuer, nerves on edge. They strain to hear the duck's engine fade away. Minutes pass. The radio at Beachhead Station crackles with a transmission from Radio Man Bottoms on the duck, growing fainter. The fog has swallowed them. Conditions are deteriorating. Then, nothing. Repeated calls to Pritchard's plane go unanswered. The duck never arrives back at the Northland. Sometime on that deadly morning of November 29th, flying blind in a milk-white blizzard, Pritchard's duck crashes into the glacier. All 3 aboard, Lieutenant Pritchard, P.O.1 Bottoms, and Corporal Howarth, are killed on impact. They gave their lives in service of the rescue. When this devastating news reaches the remaining B-17 crew by radio, the effect is shattering. Monteverde and his men had thought salvation was near. Instead, they have lost one of their own, their beloved radio operator, and the 2 Coast Guard heroes who risked everything for them. For a second time, the rescuers have become victims. A heavy pall of grief and despair descends on Snowball Camp. To make matters worse, the weather rages with renewed fury, halting any further air rescue attempts. Blizzards pound the glacier for days as if the very elements were furious. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard cutter Northland and Army units launch searches for the lost duck, but in the chaotic ice fields, their efforts yield nothing. The crash site of the duck is spotted from the air a month later, a crumpled speck half buried in snow, but recovering the bodies is deemed too dangerous. Pritchard and Bottoms would remain forever entombed in Greenland's ice, becoming the Coast Guard's only MIAs from World War II. The surviving B-17 crew, hearing of this, know that their own chances for a quick rescue just dimmed significantly. As December 1942 deepens, the 6 airmen still stranded face their grimmest period. The sun disappears below the horizon for weeks on end. In perpetual darkness and merciless cold, they endure what seems like an endless Arctic night. Gale force winds up to 125 miles per hour scream over their camp. On several occasions, resupply aircraft try to drop parachutes with food and fuel, but high winds send the canisters wildly off target. The men venture out after each storm to scavenge what they can. Some supplies are retrieved, others vanish down crevasses in plain sight. Hunger becomes a constant companion. Though additional rations were delivered, the men carefully conserve every calorie. They supplement the canned meat with whatever they have, even boiling clean shreds of leather from a spare boot, just to have something warm in their stomachs. Frostbite worsens, especially for Lieutenant O'Hara. Both of O'Hara's legs are now severely infected with gangrene from prolonged freezing. The odor of necrosis permeates the little shelter, and his crewmates do their best to clean and bandage his blackened feet each day. They fear that without amputation, O'Hara will die. But of course, surgery on a glacier is impossible. The men take turns boosting each other's morale. Sergeant Woody Puryear cracks jokes about the tropical vacation they'll take after this. Tech Sergeant Alfred Clint Best leads impromptu prayers on Sundays. Co-pilot Harry Spencer, a natural joker, keeps spirits up by talking about home-cooked meals and warm beds waiting for them. In quieter moments, some of the crew scribble farewell letters to loved ones, which they keep tucked in their pockets, just in case. Rescue attempts continue in fits and starts. In mid-December, the U.S. Army hires a renowned Canadian bush pilot to fly a Barclay Gros T-8P-1 ski plane into the fray. This odd twin-engine craft heads out from Bluey West, one loaded with hopes, but it encounters a brutal headwind and runs out of fuel, crash landing on a fjord ice not far from the coast. The pilot and navigator survive and manage to hike to safety, but the plane is lost. Another rescue plane down. By New Year's, no fewer than 5 aircraft have been wrecked in connection with this saga. The C-53, the B-17, the RAF Havoc, the Grumman Duck, and now the Barclay Gros. Greenland's deadly grip seems to tighten with each attempt. The Gremlins must be laughing at us, one rescue coordinator muses grimly as yet another plan is formulated. Through January 1943, Colonel Balkan relentlessly pushes for a solution. He requests the Navy's workhorse seaplanes, the PBY Catalina flying boats, believing they might do what nothing else has, land on the ice and take off again. It takes weeks of lobbying. The PBYs are desperately needed for anti-submarine patrols in the North Atlantic. But finally, the Navy agrees to loan 2 Catalinas for the rescue on the condition that Balkan himself oversees the landings. Modification and prep take time. The Catalinas will attempt something unprecedented, to belly land on the ice cap using their amphibious hulls as giant sleds, much as Pritchard did with the Duck. While these plans develop, ground parties make renewed efforts. An Army sledge patrol, including experienced Inuit dog handlers from the local sledge patrol, tries multiple forays toward Snowball Camp. They are beaten back by blizzards each time. One small victory. A dog sled team finally reaches and rescues the sole Army man who survived the November crevasse accident. He had stayed with the B-17 crew for a time, assisting as he could, but eventually he set out back toward the coast and was picked up. Now, the weather rescue station at Beachhead becomes the staging point for what comes next. Inside the makeshift shelter under the B-17's wing, the remaining crew grows weaker. They have now been on the glacier for 2 months, and their bodies are failing from malnutrition and cold. Simple tasks, like cutting blocks of snow to build a windbreak, leave them exhausted. Sleep is fitful, haunted by nightmares of never waking up, yet they persevere, motivated by each other's presence. They refuse to let their friend O'Hara die. In late January, as his condition worsens, Monteverde decides it's time to move O'Hara closer to the coast, even if no rescue has arrived yet. Perhaps they can meet the rescue team halfway. They place the gaunt navigator, who has lost nearly 2/3 of his body weight, down from 180 to about 60 pounds, onto the remaining Army motor sled. In early February, on a rare clear day, 2 of the strongest crewmen volunteer to sled O'Hara toward Beachhead Station. It is a desperate gambit born out of love for their brother. Monteverde and the others see them off, hoping to reunite at the coast. But fate intervenes once more. Barely a mile from camp, the sled crosses a fragile snow bridge which collapses, sending one of the men tumbling into a crevasse to his death. The remaining escort, now alone with O'Hara, cannot continue forward nor safely return to the B-17. Stranded on the open ice, he sets up a canvas tent, drags O'Hara inside, and hunkers down, hoping help will find them before the unrelenting cold claims them both. By now, the tragedy of this mission has compounded beyond imagination. 5 lives have been lost in the rescue effort, 3 in the Duck and 2 in the ice, the Army driver and the sledding crewman. The men still waiting at Snowball Camp, Monteverde, Spencer, and the 2 remaining enlisted crew, likely Spina and either Best or Puryear, know they are all on borrowed time. It is February 1943, and they have weathered the worst of winter, but they are barely hanging on. February 5th, 1943. At long last, a breakthrough. Colonel Balkan pilots a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina through a narrow window of clear weather and finds the tiny tent housing Lieutenant O'Hara and his escort on the ice cap. These 2 men have been living in that flimsy tent for over a week, burning a small stove and rationing the last of the emergency chocolate. O'Hara is barely conscious, his feet are essentially mummified. The escorting crewman is exhausted and frostbitten, but alive, ever vigilant at his friend's side. When the giant flying boat appears overhead, they can hardly believe it's real. Balchin knows landing a Catalina here is perilous, but he also knows this may be the only chance to save O'Hara's life. With consummate skill, he brings the PBY down, belly landing on the ice near the tent in a controlled skid. The big aircraft's metal hull screeches as it meets the snow, sliding to a halt not far from the stranded pair. A cheer rises from the Catalina's crew. Rescuers jump out and rush to the tent, faces wrapped in fur-lined hoods. They find O'Hara delirious and the other man weak but overjoyed to see them. In moments, they are carried into the PBY's hull. One rescuer grimly notes that O'Hara's feet have frozen solid. In fact, his toes have begun to detach due to frostbite. They carefully bundle him, trying not to do further harm. As the Catalina crew loads the survivors, a new problem arises. The PBY's hull has begun to freeze to the ice. In the short time since landing, the intense cold effectively cemented the plane in place. The engines strain. The flying boat refuses to budge. For a tense hour, Balchin and his men rock the aircraft using its wingtip floats, chipping away ice and revving the throttles. At last, with a crack, the hull breaks free. Balchin taxis the PBY in a wide circle, keeping momentum so it doesn't freeze again, while the crewmen still outside literally run alongside and clamber in through a side blister as it moves. In a cloud of snow, the Catalina powers up and lifts off the ice, carrying O'Hara and his escort to safety. Against all odds, 2 more of the lost crew are now rescued. Balchin's success electrifies the whole rescue operation. The remaining 3 men at the main B-17 camp are now the last ones unaccounted for. They have survived nearly 3 months on the glacier by this point, a feat of endurance practically unheard of. They are weak, frostbitten, and one of them can barely walk, but they are alive and still waiting. Balchin is determined to get them out. In mid-March 1943, as the Arctic begins to lighten with the approaching spring, Balchin flies another PBY, or possibly the same one, repaired and refueled, back to the ice cap. This time, he carries a specialized rescue team with dog sleds and Inuit handlers to retrieve the final trio from Snowball Camp. On March 17th, the Catalina once again belly lands on the ice near the coordinates of the old motorsled camp, a location they've used as a forward staging area. From here, the B-17 wreck is about 6 miles away across treacherous terrain. Balchin offloads a 3-man sled team and 9 hardy sled dogs onto the ice. The airmen of Snowball Camp see none of this. They are huddled in their wing shelter, unaware that help is moving towards them on the ground at last. For the next 3 days, the rescue sled team fights through the ice field to reach the crash site. Heavy snowfall and drifting have almost completely buried the B-17 by now. Only part of a wing and the nose blister poke out from a mound of snow. Inside, Lieutenant Monteverdi, Lieutenant Spencer, and their last enlisted crewmate, likely Sergeant Puryear or Sergeant Best, lie in a semi-stupor, conserving energy. Frostbite has claimed several fingers among them. All are gaunt and hollow-eyed. They have been surviving on half rations and sheer willpower. When a voice suddenly calls out from the distance, human voices, at first they think it's another hallucination, but then the barking of sled dogs echoes through the still air. Monteverdi, summoning strength he didn't know remained, crawls out and to his amazement sees figures approaching, men in parkas leading dog sleds, waving and yelling a greeting. Rescue has finally reached Snowball Camp. The scene that unfolds is deeply emotional. The hardened rescuers embrace the survivors, astonished that they are even alive. Tears freeze on cheeks. Spencer, ever the joker, musters a grin and quips, "Took you long enough," before collapsing into the arms of a rescuer. In truth, these airmen are barely clinging to life. The rescue team immediately gives them hot broth and begins evacuating them by sled back to the PBY landing site. Over rough icy terrain, it takes another couple of days to shuttle the weakened men on dog sleds. The rescuers handle them with great care, mindful that even a small injury or exposure could be fatal in their condition. Finally, by early April 1943, the last of the B-17 crew reached the Catalina camp. Colonel Balchin has been waiting for them, keeping the PBY warmed and ready. He greets Monteverde, Spencer, and the third survivor with a broad smile and perhaps moist eyes. These men are coming home after an Arctic odyssey of epic length. On April 6, 1943, Balchin's Catalina attempts takeoff with all survivors and the rescue team aboard, but the plane groans under the weight on the softening spring snow. One engine sputters and fails. The overloaded aircraft cannot lift. Rather than risk another crash, they offload everyone except the flight crew and the 3 B-17 survivors. Balchin himself, along with the sled team members, volunteer to stay behind. He assures the rescued airmen that he'll see them back at base, even if he has to walk there. The Catalina then revs up again, and carrying only its own crew and the 3 survivors, manages to get airborne on April 7th. As the big flying boat disappears toward Bluey West 1, the last of the stranded airmen are finally leaving the ice cap. Balchin and the remaining rescue party are not out of danger yet. They now must trek on foot and sled over 30 miles to the nearest outpost. But these are hardy Arctic experts, and under Balchin's leadership they set off confidently. About 9 days later, on April 16th, Balchin and his team arrive safely at Beachhead Station, frost-nipped and tired but triumphant. The 148-day nightmare is over. One of the longest and most challenging airman survival ordeals in history has ended in survival and success. Of the original 9 B-17 crew, all 6 who remained at Snowball Camp made it out alive against all odds. The cost, however, was staggering. The effort to save these men became one of the most extensive search and rescue operations ever attempted. It claimed 5 aircraft, the C-53 and B-17 that started it all, plus 3 rescue planes, the Coast Guard Duck, the Barclay Grow, and a Coast Guard Twin Beach. And 5 brave men lost their lives. Among the fallen were Lieutenant John Pritchard and Petty Officer 1 Ben Bottoms, who gave their lives on a selfless rescue flight, and Corporal Lorne Lolly Howarth, the radio man who survived a bomber crash only to perish in a second crash trying to escape. 2 others died in the icy depths of crevasses. These sacrifices underscore the brutal truth. In Greenland's war against the elements, even heroes can pay the ultimate price. Thank you for watching Frozen in Time, Gremlins, and Arctic Survival. If this incredible true story moved you, please give the video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful true survival stories and historical documentaries. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.